The call came while I had my hands inside a man's chest. 14 hours into a coronary bypass that should have taken 8. My scrub nurse tapped my shoulder and said quietly that there was a voicemail on my personal cell from a number I might want to check. She said it the way people say things when they don't want to be the one to tell you. With her eyes looking somewhere past my left ear. I didn't check it until I'd closed, until I'd walked out of the OR and pulled off my gloves, and stood under the fluorescent lights of the scrub room, feeling the particular exhaustion that only comes from spending most of the day keeping someone alive. 62 years old, 34 years of cardiothoracic surgery, and I still felt that exhaustion in my teeth. The voicemail was 47 seconds long. I listened to it twice, standing completely still next to the sink. It's me. It's Meg. I know this is the last call you expected, and I know we haven't talked in years, not since that Christmas party. But I need you to listen to me. Check your credit card statements, not the joint account, the one that has both your names on it. The Visa. Look at the Riverside Inn charges. Every other Wednesday for the past 4 months. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to be the one, but I would want someone to tell me. 47 seconds. The end of a marriage in 47 seconds delivered by a woman I'd met maybe 6 times in 31 years. My wife's college roommate from her freshman year at Northwestern. I sat down on the bench along the wall and stared at the locker across from me for a long time. My wife had been my wife since I was 31 years old. We met at a hospital fundraiser. Her in a green dress. Me still in the wrinkled blazer I'd thrown on over scrubs because I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift and hadn't had time to go home and change. She'd laughed at me for it. Said it was the most honest outfit at the party. We were married 11 months later. We raised 2 kids in the same house in Wilmette, the one with the big oak in the backyard that my son used to climb. We'd celebrated 31 years in September. Dinner at the same restaurant where I'd proposed. Her ordering the same salmon she always ordered. Me reaching across the table to hold her hand the way I always did. 7 weeks ago, I drove home that night without looking at the credit card app. I wasn't ready. I told myself I needed sleep first. Needed to think clearly. Needed to be the same version of myself who assessed risk in operating rooms before I assessed this. But the real reason was simpler and harder to say out loud. I was afraid that if I checked, and it was true, something inside me would break before I had a plan. And I have never once walked into a crisis without a plan. I checked in the morning at 5:30, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while my wife slept upstairs. The Riverside Inn, 40 miles outside the city. 12 charges in 17 weeks, always on Wednesday. Always checked in around noon. Always checked out around 6 o'clock. The room rate was $163 a night, but they only ever stayed half a day. So the rate appeared on the statement as an $80 incidental charge. The kind of thing that disappears in a long list of transactions. The kind of thing I would never have noticed if I hadn't been told exactly where to look. I set down my coffee and opened the window above the sink. It was November, cold enough that the air hurt a little coming in. I stood there breathing it for a while. 31 years. 2 children. 4 grandchildren, if you counted the one on the way. My daughter's first, due in March. My wife had been shopping for baby things just last weekend, sending me photos from the store with little captions. Does this seem too gender neutral, or just right? And I think yellow is timeless, don't you? While she was at a hotel 40 miles away every other Wednesday. I didn't go back to sleep. I showered and went to work, and performed a valve replacement on a 68-year-old retired school teacher, and I was fine, technically. My hands were steady. They've always been steady. That's the thing about being a surgeon for 34 years. You learn to put yourself somewhere else while your body does what it knows how to do. You learn to operate on autopilot in every sense of the word. But in the car on the way home, I pulled over on a side street and sat with my forehead against the steering wheel for about 10 minutes, and I was not fine at all. I didn't say anything to my wife that night. I watched her make dinner moving around our kitchen the way she had for 3 decades. The particular efficiency of a woman who knew exactly where everything was, who didn't have to think about reaching for the olive oil or the good salt. I watched her pour herself a glass of wine and ask me about my day and lean against the counter listening while I talked about the valve replacement. Her expression doing the thing it always did. That combination of genuine interest and slight distance. The distance of someone who has heard operating room stories for 31 years and loves you but has long since stopped being startled by them. She looked exactly like herself. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. I'd expected something to be different, some tell, some flicker of guilt or self-consciousness when she looked at me. But there was nothing. Just my wife in our kitchen drinking her wine, asking if I wanted garlic bread. I said yes to the garlic bread. I helped clear the table. I watched the news beside her on the couch. I lay in our bed and listened to her breathing slow into sleep while I stared at the ceiling and thought about the Riverside Inn. The next morning, I called Meg. She answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting. "I saw the statements," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry, James. I hadn't told my wife I was making this call." I'd walked out to the car in the garage, ostensibly to bring in a bag I'd left there. "How do you know?" "She told me." Meg's voice was careful, measured. Or she half told me. We've been talking more lately, the past year or so. She called me this fall, upset, not making complete sense. She said she'd been seeing someone, said it had gotten complicated. I thought she meant emotionally complicated, that she was trying to decide whether to end it or talk to you. I gave her what I thought was reasonable advice, that she needed to either end it or be honest with you. A pause. Last month, she called again. She sounded different, not like someone who was conflicted, like someone who was making plans. Permanent plans. She mentioned a financial advisor. She said he'd been helping her understand all her options. The way she said it made me feel sick. I didn't know what she meant exactly, but I knew I had to tell you. I sat in the garage with the engine off and the cold pressing in around the edges of the door. A financial advisor. That's what she said. After I hung up, I sat there for another few minutes. A financial advisor. Not a personal trainer. Not a neighbor's son. Not some opportunistic infatuation. A financial advisor. Someone who would know about assets, about accounts, about what happened to money when a spouse died. I was afraid in a way I hadn't been afraid since my residency, when I lost my first patient on the table and stood in the hallway outside the family waiting room, knowing I had to walk through that door. The particular fear of something irrevocable. That afternoon, I called my attorney. His name is Walt Briggs, and I've known him for 20 years. And he is the kind of man who has seen enough in his career that very little surprises him. When I told him what I knew, he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "Don't touch anything. Don't move money. Don't change accounts. Don't let on that you know. Give me 2 days." 2 days later, I was sitting across from him in his office looking at documents I hadn't known existed. My wife had changed our joint will 8 months ago. I had not signed it. Walt set my signature from our original documents next to the new version and pointed at the difference without saying anything. It wasn't bad work. Someone had clearly practiced, but it wasn't mine. In the new version, everything went directly to her. Immediately, with no provisions for our children, No trust structures. Nothing. Everything I'd spent 34 years building signed away in a signature that was close, but not quite mine. She had also, 4 months ago, increased my life insurance policy, doubled it to $3 million. I had not been consulted. The agent confirmed it when Walt called him. My wife had handled it herself, said we were doing estate planning. $3 million. Walt looked at me across his desk. He said, "James, this is forgery. These are felonies." He paused. "And I need to ask you directly, do you have reason to believe she intends to harm you?" I thought about Meg's voice, the way she'd said permanent plans, the way she'd said all her options. "I think I need to find out who this man is," I said. Walt wasn't happy about that answer, but he was a good enough attorney to understand that happy and right aren't always the same thing. I hired a private investigator that week. Her name was Diane Reyes, former Cook County detective, 20 years on the job before she went private. I told her everything and asked her to find out who my wife had been meeting at the Riverside Inn, what his connection to our finances was, and what, specifically, he had been advising her about. It took her 6 days. His name was Carter Flynn, 34 years old. He ran a boutique financial advisory firm with 3 employees, including himself, operating out of a shared office space in Lincoln Park. On paper, he managed portfolios for high net worth clients. In practice, Diane had found 2 prior civil complaints from clients who'd alleged misconduct funds moved without authorization. Suspicious timing on account changes. Both cases settled quietly. He drove a car he shouldn't have been able to afford on his disclosed income. He had a gambling problem. He managed the way people manage gambling problems when they're not ready to admit they have one, which is to say, barely and expensively. He had met my wife 14 months ago at a charity gala she'd attended with her book club. He was drowning in private debt, and somewhere along the way, he had apparently decided that my wife's grief at my death was a problem he could solve for both of them. The email came next. Diane had accessed his personal account through methods I didn't ask her to explain, and she forwarded me a thread that made my vision go briefly white around the edges. It went back 9 months, flirtatious at first, then intimate. Then, somewhere around the 6-month mark, something else entirely. He had been methodical about it, careful. He'd laid the groundwork slowly, the insurance change, the will, and then, 2 months ago, a shift in tone that I read 4 times before I fully understood what I was reading. The thing about coronary events is that they're not suspicious in a man his age, especially one with his history. My wife had once mentioned, casually, years ago, that my father had died of a heart attack at 67. I had apparently never considered that information could be used against me. There are ways to accelerate the timeline. Natural looking. I know someone. It would need to happen somewhere private, low traffic, a cabin, a lake house, somewhere you'd plausibly take him for a romantic weekend. He'd think it was a reconciliation. Men that age, they want to believe. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and read that paragraph 6 times. Men that age, they want to believe. He wasn't wrong that I would have believed it. If my wife had suggested a weekend away, a reconciliation, a chance to reconnect, I would have gone. I would have packed a bag and driven wherever she asked me to drive, and felt grateful that we were trying. I would have wanted to believe so bully that I wouldn't have questioned anything. That's what made it difficult to breathe. Not the betrayal, not even the plan, but the accuracy of it. How well she knew me, and what she'd been willing to do with that knowledge. I forwarded everything to Walt. I drove to his office at 8 o'clock in the morning and sat across from him while he read it. and I watched his face do the thing that faces do when they encounter something they know is real and wish were not. "We go to the FBI," he said. "Today? Not yet. James, give me a week. I want this to be airtight. I want them both in prison for a long time, and that requires evidence that cannot be explained away. If we go now, she lawyers up. She claims the emails are out of context. He claims the same. I need them to act." Walt spent 20 minutes trying to change my mind. I understood every argument he made. I'd spent 34 years making arguments in operating rooms about risk and benefit. I made mine. My wife thought I was completely unaware. As long as she believed that, she wouldn't rush. She wouldn't improvise. She'd stick to the plan. And the plan required a specific location and a specific opportunity that hadn't been created yet. I had the advantage of knowing what was coming. I needed to use it. He didn't like it. But he agreed to 1 week. That week, I was the best version of a husband I'd been in years. I came home on time. I made dinner twice. I asked about her book club, about her sister's renovation project, about the baby shower she was supposedly helping plan for our daughter. I held her hand during the news. I said I love you at the right moments, the reflexive way you say it after 30 years. And I felt something complicated and awful every single time, because part of me meant it, and part of me was cataloging her responses the way I cataloged vital signs. She mentioned the cabin on a Thursday evening. We were finishing dinner, and she said, in that particular tone she used for good ideas, casual, like it had just occurred to her that she'd been thinking we should get away, just the two of us. There was a lake house she'd read about, a rental up in Wisconsin, private, quiet, beautiful in early winter when the other tourists were gone. She said I worked too hard. She said we hadn't had real time alone since the summer. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, and her eyes were warm, and she said, "I think we need this." I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about everything I knew. I thought about the email. He'd think it was a reconciliation. Men that age, they want to believe. I said, "That sounds perfect." She smiled. And it was a genuine smile, I think. The smile of someone who has just confirmed that a plan is working. The next morning, I called Walt, and then we called the FBI. The agent assigned to the case was a woman named Karen Nowak, and she was everything I needed her to be. Thorough, methodical, and absolutely unbothered by the emotional weight of what I was telling her. She listened to everything. She reviewed the documents, the emails, the financial records. She made 2 phone calls while I was still sitting in the room. When she looked up, she said, "We're going to need to give them what they want." Which is how I found myself 3 weeks later agreeing to a weekend trip to a lake house in Vilas County, Wisconsin. The FBI had already identified Carter Flynn's contact, a man with a criminal record who had done, among other things, 2 years for manslaughter in a case involving tampered medication. Diane had found the connection. The FBI confirmed it. They'd been watching Flynn for 48 hours before my wife ever brought up the lake house, and they already had enough to move. But Agent Noak, like me, wanted airtight. The lake house was real. My wife had rented it legitimately through a vacation rental site. Isolated, accessible by one road, surrounded by frozen lake on 2 sides. If you were planning what they were planning, it was a good choice. That was the part that stayed with me during those final days. How much thought she'd put into it. I wore a wire from the moment we left the house in Wilmette. The drive up took 3 hours. My wife was in a good mood, better than she'd been with me in a long time. She played music she liked, old Fleetwood Mac, and sang along under her breath, and pointed out things through the window, frozen ponds and deer standing at the tree line. She looked happy, genuinely happy. The happiness, I understood now, of someone who believes they are very close to the beginning of a new life. We talked more on that drive than we had in months. She asked about my retirement plans, something she hadn't shown much interest in before. When did I think I'd stop operating? Did I think I'd want to travel? Did I picture us moving somewhere warmer? I answered everything honestly, because I couldn't think of a reason not to. Because some part of me wanted to know if there was a version of this conversation where she was really asking, where some piece of her was still the woman in the green dress who'd laughed at my wrinkled blazer. If there was, I couldn't find it. We arrived at the lake house at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was beautiful, genuinely dark wood and high ceilings, and windows facing the lake. Ice spreading out in every direction under a white winter sky. My wife moved through the rooms with the ease of someone who'd studied them, who knew the layout already. She knew where the fireplace lighter was. She knew which burner on the stove ran hot. She'd been there before. That landed somewhere deep in my chest and stayed there. I had been told by Agent Novak, stay calm, stay normal. Do not let her know anything is wrong. There were agents in the tree line a quarter mile back. There was a device in the kitchen that was recording everything. She had told me several times that nothing would happen to me. She had told me that Flynn's associate had been picked up that morning on a traffic stop in Rhinelander, 20 miles north, and that regardless of what happened this weekend, the man who was supposed to harm me was already in custody. I knew all of this, and I still did not sleep that first night. My wife cooked. She opened a bottle of wine she'd brought from home, a good one, and poured us both a glass and made pasta and lit candles on the table. She was attentive in a way that she hadn't been in years. She refilled my glass without being asked. She touched my arm when she walked past. After dinner, she suggested we sit by the fire, and she curled up against me the way she used to when we were young, before the children, before the years settled between us like furniture that never quite gets moved. I sat there with her head on my shoulder, and the fire going, and the lake visible through the window, dark now under a clouded sky. And I thought about 31 years, about the hospital fundraiser, about the green dress, about every morning I'd left before she was awake, and every night I'd come home to find dinner kept warm in the oven, and the particular specific ways that a life becomes what it becomes, without either person noticing it happening. I had not been a perfect husband. I knew that. I'd been absent in ways that went beyond my hours. I'd come home from the hospital and still be somewhere else mentally, still in the operating room, still carrying whatever weight the day had left in me. And I hadn't always been able to put it down at the door the way she needed me to. She told me that more than once in the middle years before she stopped telling me things. I'd heard her and done what I always did in the face of problems I didn't know how to solve. I'd worked more, given more materially, substituted what I could do easily for what she actually needed. None of that justified what she'd chosen, not even close. But I sat with it that night in the firelight, and I let it be complicated. Because it was. Around midnight, she went to bed. I stayed up watching the fire die down, and I thought about the morning. Agent Nowak had told me the timing. Saturday around noon, once they'd confirmed Flynn was in position. He was staying at a motel in the next county, waiting for a call. The agents had been monitoring his phone. The call would come from my wife, and when it did, they'd move. What I hadn't told Agent Novak was that I wasn't going to stay in the bedroom while it happened. She woke up before me on Saturday. I heard her in the kitchen, heard the coffee maker, heard the particular sounds of someone moving with purpose. When I came downstairs, she was at the table with her phone, and she closed it quickly when she heard me on the stairs. The same gesture my son used to make as a teenager, when he didn't want me to see what he was reading. the instinct to hide something. The instinct you develop when you've been hiding something for a long time. We had breakfast. We talked. She suggested a walk along the frozen lake's edge, said the light was beautiful in the morning, that we should take advantage of it. I agreed. We walked for an hour, and she held my arm, and she pointed at things. A hawk, a formation of ice at the water's edge, the shadow line on the opposite bank. She was a good companion on that walk. She had always known how to make a place feel inhabited, how to make a moment feel present. Tense, that had been one of the things I loved about her. We went back inside around 11 o'clock. She said she needed to make a call, that she'd promised her sister she'd check in. She stepped into the bedroom and closed the door. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the lake. She was in there for 6 minutes. When she came out, she was calm, composed in that particular way people are when they've just done something they've been psyching themselves up for. She poured herself a second cup of coffee and stood at the window and said, "The ice looked like it was starting to break up near the far bank." My phone buzzed. A message from Agent Novak. "He's in the driveway." I stood up. My wife turned her head around when she heard the chair scrape back. She looked at my face, and something moved in hers, a flicker of confusion, a recalibration. She said, "James?" "I know," I said. 2 words. That's all I had. The front door opened before she could answer. Agent Novak came in first, badge out, 2 agents behind her. Another pair came through the side entrance. Through the window, I could see 2 more at the driveway, where a man in a dark jacket was already against the hood of a car, with his hands being moved behind his back. My wife stood there with both hands around her coffee mug and went very still. Flynn's associate, the man who'd been sent to make my death look like a coronary event. Natural for a man my age, especially one with my family history, was being handcuffed in the driveway of a lake house that my wife had rented specifically because it was private and quiet, and no one would hear anything. Agent Novak said my wife's name, said she was under arrest, said the charges: conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, forgery. She listed them in a flat, professional voice, and with each one she named, my wife's face changed slightly. The color going, the composure going, something underneath the composure going, until by the time Agent Novak said, "You have the right to remain silent." She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her in 31 years. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse. Something rawer and less formed than that. The look of someone who has run a very long calculation and arrived at the last possible moment at an answer they didn't expect. She said my name. Just my name. I didn't answer. I walked to the window and looked at the frozen lake, and I listened to the agent recite the rest of the Miranda warning behind me, and I breathed. There is a moment in certain surgeries when you know the patient will live, not the moment the crisis is resolved. Before that. A few seconds before, when the numbers begin to move in the right direction, and your hands already know what they're doing, and you can feel the situation turning. A kind of certainty that arrives ahead of its evidence. Standing at that window, I felt something like the opposite of that. The certainty that something that had been alive for 31 years would not be alive much longer. That there was no version of the next months and years that didn't carry this weight. That I would be okay, technically. That okay is not the same as whole. I heard them take her out. I stood at the window for a long time after the cars were gone. Agent Novak came and stood beside me. She didn't say anything for a while, which I appreciated. Then she said, "The wire got everything." The call she made from the bedroom confirmed the plan. Combined with the emails, the documents, the financial evidence, and the associate's testimony, she won't be going home. "I know," I said. Are you all right? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I will be, I said. Not today, but I will be. The associate cooperated within 48 hours. He gave up everything how Flynn had recruited him, what the plan was, what substance was going to be introduced into my food or drink over the course of the weekend to simulate a cardiac event, how it had been timed, how my wife was supposed to react when I collapsed, what she was supposed to say when the paramedics arrived. They had rehearsed it. Flynn was arrested at his Lincoln Park office on Monday morning. He didn't cooperate. His attorney argued entrapment for about 40 minutes before Agent Noack laid out the 9 months of emails, and then the attorney asked for a recess and came back and asked about a plea deal. My wife didn't take a deal. She went to trial. It lasted 11 days. I sat through all of it on the side of the courtroom behind the prosecution. And on the second day, my son sat down beside me without a word and put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. My daughter, 8 months pregnant, came on the 4th day and cried quietly through most of the morning session, and then dried her eyes and held my hand during the afternoon. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts. The sentencing was 2 months later. Flynn's associate had already received 12 years. Flynn himself received 18 with the forgery and fraud charges stacking onto the conspiracy count. My wife received 22 years. She was 58 years old. The judge said in the sentencing statement that the premeditation, the duration of the planning, and the specific exploitation of trust made leniency impossible to justify. I sat in that courtroom and felt a stillness inside me that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Those words imply something was recovered. Nothing was recovered. 31 years of a life together don't become something you understand or accommodate. They become the fixed fact of a thing that happened and cannot unhappen. And you either carry it or you don't. But you cannot put it down. Meg came to the sentencing. I hadn't asked her to. She appeared in the gallery that morning and caught my eye and gave me a small nod. And afterward, outside on the courthouse steps, she came to find me. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better than I should be," I said. "Or worse, depending on the day." She nodded like that made sense. "For what it's worth, I've asked myself 1,000 times if I should have told you sooner, if I should have pushed harder when she called me in September. You told me in time," I said. "That's all that matters." She started to apologize again, and I stopped her. I told her what I meant. She had done for a stranger she barely knew the thing that took the most courage. She had refused to stay silent. She had carried that phone call with her for weeks before she made it, knowing what it would do, knowing it might fracture something that couldn't be put back together. She had made the call anyway. That is not a small thing. In my experience, it is a rare thing. I sold the house in Wilmette the following spring. My daughter had her baby in March, a girl, healthy, 7 pounds 4 ounces, and I was there. Which is the thing I am most grateful for about any of this, that I was there. I held my granddaughter in the hospital room at 2 o'clock in the morning while everyone else slept, and I looked at her face, which was new and old at the same time, the way newborn faces always are, and I thought, here is something entirely new. Here is something that has nothing to do with any of this. I took early retirement from the surgical practice. I'd been planning to stay until 65, but when I thought about what I wanted the next years to look like, more operating rooms was not the answer. I bought a smaller place in Evanston, close enough to my son's family that I can walk over for dinner. I have a view of the lake from my kitchen window. I volunteer now at a men's mental health clinic on the north side. I started going there not to volunteer, but because Walt suggested, quietly, that I talk to someone. And Walt is usually right about things. I talked to someone for 8 months, and then I started volunteering. And now I run a support group on Tuesday evenings for men going through divorce and betrayal. Mostly younger than me. Sometimes not. I tell them my story when it seems awful. When someone in the room is sitting with their jaw clenched and their arms folded, and the particular posture of a man who believes that what is happening to him is something he should be able to handle alone, without speaking, without needing anything from anyone. I recognize that posture because I wore it for 62 years. I tell them, trust the people who speak up. People, trust the call that comes at the wrong moment. Trust your instincts when they tell you something is wrong. And trust the people who love you enough to tell you the thing you don't want to hear. My son and I talk more now than we ever did when I was operating 12 hours a day. We have breakfast on Saturdays at a diner near his house, and he tells me about his work, his marriage, his particular worries about the world, and I tell him about mine. And it is not the kind of conversation I was capable of having 10 years ago. That's something. That's real. I think about my wife sometimes, not daily, not in the way I did in the first months when it was impossible not to, when every habit of 31 years turned and found nothing where she used to be. Less than that now. I think about the woman in the green dress. I think about the woman who stopped telling me what she needed and started making other plans. I think about the distance between those two women and what it cost both of us. And I don't have the clarity or the arrogance to assign all of it to one person. What I know is this. She chose murder. She chose it over a conversation, over a lawyer, over 31 years of history that might have been honored even in its ending. She chose it deliberately over months with the kind of patience and calculation that has no language I know how to speak. And she will have 22 years to sit with that choice. And I genuinely do not know what she does with that time. And I have had to make peace with not knowing. I don't visit. I received a letter from her attorney 6 months after sentencing. I didn't respond. Some doors, once closed the way ours was closed, don't open back up. That's not bitterness. That's just physics. What I have instead is this. A Tuesday evening with a room full of men who needed someone to tell them that surviving something is not the same as being fine, and that not being fine is not the same as being broken. A granddaughter who is learning to walk and has my nose, according to my daughter, although I've never seen it myself. A kitchen window with a view of the lake, a cup of coffee in the morning that I drink slowly now, without my phone. Without the particular urgency of someone who has always believed there is somewhere more important to be. There isn't. This is where I am. This is what I have. Last month, Meg called again. She said she was coming to Chicago for her nephew's graduation in June and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes. We talked for 20 minutes catching up on the ordinary scaffolding of lives, her husband's retirement, her youngest leaving for college, a house project they'd been putting off for years that they'd finally started. She laughed at something I said, and it was a good laugh. Easy and real. The laugh of someone who has known you in a particular way. Not well, but truthfully, which is sometimes more important. When we hung up, I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand and thought about the 47-second voicemail in the scrub room. The way she'd said, I would want someone to tell me. The 6 times in 31 years that I'd met her. How completely unprepared I'd been for her voice to be the one that saved my life. There are people who will stay silent to keep the peace, to avoid the mess, to preserve something that isn't theirs to preserve. And then there are people who will call the wrong number at the wrong time and say the hard, true thing anyway, because they decided long ago that they would rather live with the discomfort of speaking than with the weight of having said nothing. I am alive because of the second kind. That is the thing I tell the men in my Tuesday group when they're sitting with their arms folded and their jaws clenched, when they're trying to hold the whole weight of it alone. I tell them, let someone tell you. Let someone speak up. And when they do, when the call comes, when the voicemail comes, when the thing you don't want to hear comes in a voice you barely recognize, listen. That's all. Just listen. The rest, if you're methodical and careful and willing to ask for help, you can figure out from there. I know. I'm 62 years old, starting over in a smaller house with a kitchen window and a Tuesday evening group and a granddaughter learning to walk. And I'm okay. More than okay on the good days. More than okay.